Hi, and welcome back to my shop. I've now finished designing the sides for my step stool, and I've gone ahead and in the last episode created the template that will be used to form the sides. And now I'm ready to move on to the next step of the project, and that's really sourcing the material. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to be entirely made out of cherry. Because of the way that the curves work on this form, I need the grain to be running horizontally. That way I won't have grain running up and down where it might be really easy to snap off one of these thin legs. I do want the cherry to be relatively thick, and I also need a fairly wide glue up in the end, because with the grain running this way, it needs to basically be as wide as this step stool is tall. So I'm effectively going to use a stacked lamination technique. And what that means is I'll have one piece at the bottom that will cover from the tip of the front to the tip of the back. And then my next stack, which I'll glue to that one, will be shorter, and then the next one will be a little bit shorter and move over to the left, and so on and so forth. Depending on how wide of a board I can get at my hardwood store, I might be able to get away with four pieces in this stacked lamination. The other thing is I want to book match the two sides to the step stool so that the grain mirrors from one side to the other. So it also means I'm going to have to find a fairly thick piece of cherry. And it has to be long enough so that I can source all of the pieces in the stacked lamination from one board so that the color is very consistent across the stack. So that'll be my next step, is going and finding just the right board for this project. I just got back from my lumber yard, and they had this really nice piece of 12-quarter cherry. It's a little over, it's almost 9 inches wide, 12 quarters thick, and 8 feet long. And that should give me plenty of material to be able to source the different pieces I need for my stacked lamination. I managed to get a piece that's completely clear, or at least along one side it's completely clear. And it has some pretty interesting grain, and it has some curves to it, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to use that to my advantage. Flipping the board over, however, and this thing is heavy, you'll see that there is a knot up here and a defect around it. The knot itself is actually integral to the piece. It's not going anywhere, but this recess is a problem. I really can't have that in the project, especially since it won't be mirrored on the other side. Here's a closer look at this knot, and where some people might see a flaw, I'm actually seeing a significant advantage I might have here. The grain that follows the knot has to actually get itself around where that branch was growing. So we do get some really interesting curved grain here, and I can see already that there's going to be some nice coloring in here, so you'll see some color variation around this area as well. So taking a look at my sketch, I'm thinking if I can get that knot out of this first piece, so the knot maybe would be right here and I could cut it out, then that would actually be a fantastic piece of stock to use for the first lamination, or the first tier in my stacked lamination. So I will now go ahead and mark this first piece. It needs to be about 28 inches long, just under 28 inches. I know I'm gonna lose about an inch or so off the end of this in order to get the defect right at the peak of my curve there. And I wanna leave a couple of inches at the end as well, so I'll just mark it in 31 inches. That way, if I have any snipe on the end of the board, I still have a little bit of room to work with. So that's where I'm gonna be able to cut that off, and then I'll be able to resaw this with a more manageable size piece, so I don't have to resaw big long lengths of this 12-quarter stock. Ordinarily, with a piece of wood this thick, I would break out my electric chainsaw. It makes quick work, but the downside to it is that it cuts a really wide kerf, and it also splinters some of that end grain out, so you even lose a little bit more. You can almost lose a full inch by using the chainsaw. And on this board, I really want to preserve as much as I can, especially on the end here, because I want these two pieces to be as long as possible. I'm really cutting it close there. So I'm turning to a little bit of an unlikely candidate, and frankly I've never used this for fine woodworking before, but this is a reciprocating saw, or what people often call a sawzall. And the blade is long enough that I can get through this board, and the blade is thin enough that I'm going to have a much smaller kerf and it'll be a cleaner cut. So I've just got a stand that I'm going to raise up and leave just about a half of an inch shy of the end here, and that's going to catch my cutoff. This is a pretty big, heavy chunk that's going to be falling off, and I really don't want to damage it when it finally cuts clean. Now, I've looked all over the place and I cannot figure out where the dust port is for this thing, so I'm just going to have to do without. So if I spin this around, you'll be able to see that that's a much cleaner cut than I would have gotten if I'd used the chainsaw. In fact, I might have to use the Sawzall a little bit more often in furniture making. Now, these boards are so wide, I don't even need to use the fence to edge joint. Now that I've got one straight edge, I can rip this to final width. Now you can see, I think from this angle, that my block has a bit of a bow. It's kind of curving in this direction. So when I go to do my resawing, where I want to split this in half, it would be really good to know where the actual middle of this board is, because what might be the middle up here is not the middle on the other side. So I think for these, especially the ones that are bowed, if they aren't all bowed, I'm going to actually joint one side and then I'm going to plane the other side parallel to it. Then I'll know exactly where the middle is and I'll resaw it at that point. Now that I've got it actually dimensioned, I can find my middle. So it's 2 3/4 of an inch. So I just go to 1 3/8 and mark my center. And then all I'm going to do is take a marking gauge and set that to that distance. Again, this doesn't have to be precise because I'm going to be milling all of these to final thickness later. But I'm going to use that as my reference point. And I'll just put a pencil mark in there to darken it a little bit. And now I can resaw away. I've gone ahead and stickered all the stock now after resawing it, and I've left it here in my shop for about a week, which should be enough time to relieve any remaining stresses in the stock and get it acclimated to my shop. I did also mark the end grain of each pair, so this says 1A and 1B, indicating that this is the number 1 segment that I cut from the board and that it's A and B, so that I don't lose track of which pairs go together, because I do want the 2 sides of this stool to match up. Here's one of the smaller segments that I cut, and just laying it down on a dead flat surface like my jointer bed, I can see that I got a very small amount of bowing with this coming off the resawing operation. And I did get a little bit of cupping here, but really not too dramatically bad, which is actually pretty good for a piece of stock this thick. So I will need to go through and rejoint all of the surfaces and then plane them as thick as possible, and then that'll give me my final dimension stock that I can start gluing up.